grade. And how we do that is I have this little sheet that I send around, and it seems like this is like the most difficult part of this class, is getting this form to go around row to row. So I usually sit towards the back. Try to do your best to make sure it gets back there. Because the other part of your grade requirement is to ask questions. And you, as part of your grade, you're supposed to ask at least one question of the speaker each week. And ideally, you do that live here in this room, either during or at the end when there's going to be time for questions. If you run out of time, which sometimes does happen, you can also write down a question, or scrap paper in here if you want, and hand it in to me before you leave to make sure that you've asked your question. But what normally happens, and hopefully this gets back to me in the back of the room, so if you ask questions and I know who you are, I can just jot down that you asked the question. There are some rules on here. We webcast these seminars both live and they'll be archived. And so we've established some rules if you can't attend watching the seminar after the fact in the archived version, but no more than 3 times. We're setting a limit. That's sort of our new rule. And then the final thing on your grade for a letter grade is the written assignment, which is explained on the back. You have 3 options. The vast majority of students, at least that take it as a USP class, do a reflective journal, and it's explained there. You do have an option occasionally.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Chris Monsere. I'm a research faculty member in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. I started at PSU here in April, not that long ago, and prior to that I was the highway safety engineer at the Oregon DOT. So one of the first projects that I started to work on when I came to PSU was this project, writing a report for the Oregon DOT on impacts and issues related to proposed changes in Oregon's interstate speed limit. So the title's somewhat misleading because the changes aren't proposed anymore. They've already made their decision and have not made only minor changes in some urban areas. But what I'm going to talk about today is sort of the process that they went through to make those decisions and how our report contributed to that, and go over some of it was sort of a literature review, research summary, and some professional opinion on what might they expect system-wide had they made changes to the speeds from 65 to 70 miles an hour. So in some background in probably every legislative session since 1997, some legislator has tried to raise the minimum or the maximum interstate speeds from 65 to either 70 or 75. I think, I'm not exactly sure, but at least one time the bill passed the legislature in the House, and Governor Kitzhaber, who was a former emergency room surgeon, vetoed that bill. So in 2003, the legislature did pass a bill that didn't specifically raise this maximum speed limits, but allowed the department to consider raising the speeds to 70. So it had two requirements. One, that the Department of Transportation had to review the interstate system and determine the safe and reasonable speed for each section of the highway. They could raise it to 70, they could lower it, so they had flexibility. The bill just allowed them to 70 was now the maximum speed they could raise it to. But it did have a little caveat to it, somewhat probably worked in with the trucking lobby, that if they raised the passenger car maximum speed limit to 70, they also had to raise the maximum speed for trucks to 65, which are currently at 55. So as part of that, they initiated two public rulemaking processes. One was how they were going to go about determining what a safe and reasonable speed was. So they had some existing statutory language, and they took they went around the state in about 6 public meetings and had some input from the public, a lot of internal debate with staff and other commissions in the department, and kind of came up with a process on how they were going to raise the speed. So that was the first set of the rulemaking authority. And then the second was just they were going to go through a process that would actually, the rulemaking would set the speeds on all of the interstates. So the legislature, the law that they passed essentially from the time the law was passed till ODOT did the second rulemaking, essentially there was no maximum speeds on the interstate, so ODOT had to pass some temporary speed orders. So the process that they came up with was this here, is that the department was going to do the engineering investigations of the sections of the highway. So they would look at the crash performance, they would measure the existing speeds of vehicles on the roadway, they would get input from law enforcement. They divided up the interstates into about 40 sections in varying lengths, depending on sort of consistent geometry. They would get input from law enforcement, from emergency services, and they would compile reports basically about each section. And what they couldn't do, and what they felt they couldn't do on the section-by-section basis, was write sort of an overall sort of a system impact of what would happen to sort of the crash experience and the safety impact. So would crashes increase? Would fatalities increase? What would be the impacts to the public health system? Are there any environmental issues associated with raising the speed? Are there travel time benefits? And is there adequate enforcement from the Oregon State Police to sort of enforce a higher speed? So what they decided to do was require a policy report, and that's where PSU came in. So PSU teamed with Oregon Health and Sciences University and a local transportation engineering consultant, Kittleson Associates, and to produce this policy report, sort of a system-wide impact. So up here in the first box, ODOT would take those two reports. They would make a recommendation on what the speed should be on each section. They would present that to a panel called the Speed Zone Review Panel, which has representatives of cities, counties, ODOT, and a citizen member. They would review that, and they would, taking into account the engineering report and the policy report and ODOT's recommendations, and make a final recommendation to the Oregon Transportation Commission, which is appointed by the governor, and they would make the final rule on what the speed should be. So that's kind of what the process was, and now I'll kind of walk you through what our report found. So over the holidays, I was reading Portland Monthly magazine, and buried on some page at the bottom was some statutes in city of Portland, some historical ones. And so an early Portland speed limit is nobody should ride their horse, mule, or beasts of burden at any speed greater than 6 miles an hour. So, and this was in 1868. So this shows that, you know, in transportation, speed limits have always been sort of in interest to people limiting the speed of travel as sort of a trade-off between efficiency, mobility, and safety. So just historical context for interstate speeds is most all speed limits are set by the local government agency that operates the roadway. So the federal government has only gotten involved twice, once in World War II as an emergency measure, and second in a period from 1974 to 1995 where there was a national maximum speed limit brought on in 1974 by the energy crisis. So they imposed a 55-mile-an-hour maximum speed on all roadways, including interstates, and they sort of linked that to federal highway funds. So you had to do some significant enforcement on the interstates to keep speeds at 55 miles an hour, so you could get some. Otherwise, there was a penalty in getting highway construction dollars. So that kind of went on until about 1987 when Congress allowed states to raise the speeds on rural interstates only to 65 miles an hour. And then in 1995, they got out of the business altogether, and the states could do whatever they want. And so this is a kind of a editorial cartoon from the Green Bay Gazette on what happens when states are allowed to sort of pick their own speeds. So it's not quite as bad, and Matt Lasky will notice these images because he helped me make these images of and did the research on where all the speed limits were. But for light vehicles, Oregon is the only western state that still has a 65-mile-an-hour maximum speed limit. Washington and California both have 70. You see a big piece of the western United States of maximum speeds of 75 miles an hour. Down in the south at 70, and then sort of the more populated Northeast and Iowa also have 65. So that's kind of the current status as of September. I don't think anything has changed since then, but those are the maximum speeds on interstates. There is less uniformity for truck speeds, and one of the key issues in the report was talking about what the difference in what the safety impacts of having differential speeds for cars and trucks are. So just to let you know that there is some states impose lower limits on maximum limits on trucks than they do on cars. And I'll have some more slides later. So our report basically was going to sort of seek to answer these general questions. So one, and I'll sort of lay them out in sort of how we came to some of our conclusions. One, will vehicle speeds increase if you change the signs from 65 to 70 miles an hour? Two, what could you expect in terms of safety and health impacts? Is there a safety, are different car and truck speed limits safe? That was a pretty significant debate. Are there any economic benefits to raising the speed limits? And what might you expect in terms of environmental impacts? So I talk a little bit about different measures of speed, so I just wanted to give a quick graph. If this is a distribution of speeds, and then this is the number of observations on the y-axis, and these are speeds on the bottom. We often talk about, in traffic engineering terms, the 85th percentile speed. So a lot of times it gets misquoted. I've seen legislators misquote it probably every time they talk about it. But the 85th percentile speed is the speed at which 85% or less of the vehicles are traveling free flow. So it doesn't mean that's the average speed or everybody's traveling that speed. It's the speed at which 85% or less of the vehicles are traveling at. So it's traditionally been a good speed to pick as a balance between enforcement and safety. So the idea is that most drivers choose a safe and reasonable speed at most times which to operate, and that if you set your speed near the 85th percentile speed, most drivers will be in compliance with the speed limit, and you'll have a small proportion that are in excess of the posted speed limit. Makes it a little bit easier for enforcement, and adds kind of puts some trust in the driver selecting speeds. So the first question is will speeds increase? And perhaps it's, when you change the signs, you'd expect speeds to increase. But currently, even though the maximum speed is 65 miles an hour posted, sort of the average speed is 67 miles an hour, and the 85th percentile speed on most of the rural interstate sections is 70 to 74 miles an hour. So people are well above the posted speeds already. So, so some of the arguments were, well, let's just change the signs because people are already traveling above that anyways, and we probably wouldn't expect to see any changes in speed. So, but the factors sort of influencing what people choose, speeds they choose to drive, are one is the posted speed limit, two is the likelihood of enforcement, and what's their sort of level of comfort at higher speeds. So we looked at states that changed their speeds from 65 to 70, and this is only a snapshot of them, but in all cases, over time, the speeds have continued to increase after the signs have changed, even if the speeds were above 65 miles an hour already when the signs were changed. So kind of all previous experience indicates that the speeds are still going to increase when you change the signs. So kind of another interesting perspective for Oregon is that most of the enforcement on interstate highways is done by the Oregon State Patrol. Not in all cases, but in most of the sections, they have responsibility for enforcement. And if you look on this graph, we looked at the surrounding states, and sort of their trooper strength is the blue bar. So California with 6,000 troopers and Oregon with 329 troopers. And if you sort of looked at the number of rural interstate miles, California with 1,300, in Oregon with 600. And if you sort of scaled this kind of as number of troopers per rural interstate mile, sort of this would be a kind of a maximum coverage if every trooper was on the interstate and that was the only thing they were doing. Besides Idaho, Oregon has relatively low enforcement. So part of probably our most comparable state would be Washington. They have nearly double the trooper presence on their interstate highways. And what this also doesn't quite show is that Oregon state troopers have responsibilities besides traffic enforcement. They have to fish and wildlife. They do criminal enforcement. And in Washington and in Idaho and some of the other states, they have specifically, that's their duties as traffic control enforcement only. So if you took that into account, the Oregon numbers look, even less of an presence. And you can probably know from your practical experience in driving Oregon's interstates is that the trooper presence on the interstate system is not all that great. So there was some other issues on whether if you raise speeds on interstates where it sort of propagate to the rest of the system, will drivers become accustomed to drive at higher speeds and sort of that propagate to the rest of the system and cause problems. We looked at some of the research, and it's true that there is a driver speed adaptation if you drive at higher speeds. If you exit an interstate to another facility, probably for about 6 or 7 minutes, your perception of your speed is less than what it actually is. So there will be some spillover effect on adjacent roadways where people probably will drive a little bit faster. And especially on roadways that aren't interstates, like US 26, that wasn't subject to change, or Oregon 22 out of Salem, that look like interstates, but the speed wouldn't be raised. People would likely drive those like the speed had been increased. So our conclusions were that the speeds would likely increase 2 to 4 miles an hour, sort of on average, that there was a lack of adequate enforcement resources, and that was sort of recognized by many participants in the process. But we didn't expect sort of a system-wide overall increase in vehicle speeds. So sort of the big question was what would be the impact on safety? So would there be a change in the number of crashes, in fatalities, and injuries? And it's a very difficult question to get at, even though there's been a lot of somewhat rigorous studies on the issue. It's still not very conclusive. So what we did is you can sort of look at it in 3 ways. 1, how speed impacts the physical influence on crashes. 2, you can look at studies that have specifically looked at crash causation and see what impact speed has on that. And then lastly, you can look at the observational studies of speed limit changes on crash frequency, which there's been quite a number. So this graph sort of shows the AASHTO design considerations for stopping distance. It's for wet pavements with some assumptions in perception reaction time. So not anything earth-shattering, but as speed increases, braking distance increases with the square of velocity. So an 8% increase in speed from 65 to 70 miles an hour would increase stopping distance by 13%. So it's not a linear relationship. And speed also has influence on your maneuvering. It takes away time to avoid obstacles or other collisions. So speed definitely does have an impact, or it does play into account in those two things that would be involved in crashes. Sort of also undisputable is that crashes at higher speeds are almost always more severe. So the relationship had been demonstrated in both observational and empirical studies and also medical studies, that higher vehicle speeds, that the higher vehicle speed before the point of impact almost always results in more severe collisions. So speed as a causal factor in crashes, just looking at sort of raw data sets, a lot of the focus is on fatal crashes just because the data for those crashes is typically more dependable, and that there has been a police investigation of the crash, whereas some of the other crashes, the data is either from citizens or there's not as much time spent on the investigation of those. So NHTSA, which is the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, compiles nationwide fatal accident statistics, has 31% of Oregon fatal crashes have some speed as a causal factor in that. ODOT has it at a little higher, and that's at 52%, and that's just due to different definitions of when speed was a causal factor. So the NHTSA definition is a little bit more rigorous. If you look at all crashes, and there was a study done in the late 70s by Treat et al., and it's called the Tri-Level Indiana Study. It's probably still referred to as one of the most comprehensive studies of crash causation mechanisms. They looked at crashes in sort of 3 levels. One, just looking at the crash records. One was sort of a more in-depth team review, and a 3rd level with a complete field investigation with police officers, psychologists, engineers, a whole trained team of people to determine the causes of those crashes. So they started out with about 10,000 crashes, and the 3rd level, the most rigorous, they had about 600 crashes, all in Indiana on all roadways. And they found speed to be still an important causal factor, but not nearly as important as if you were just looking at fatal crashes. So about 7 to 15% of all crashes have speed as some sort of causal factor. And this was rigorously defined as if that factor had not been present, then the crash would not have occurred. So it wasn't as subjective as some of the other data. So this meant that speed was definitely a contributing factor in the crash. More recently, a study looking at another federal data set sort of found percentages on the same level. And there's less work on truck crashes, these kind of post-investigations, but it's a little bit less than the total vehicle. So sort of looking at a pie chart of and speed, I guess, is also an important contributing factor in a lot of single vehicle crashes. So vehicles that have departed the roadway typically have been involved and have speed as a causal factor. And that's important because most of the crashes, the serious crashes that occur on interstates, are or roadway departure crashes. And this isn't just interstates. This is all Oregon fatal crash data. But you can see that the fixed object that's off roadway hitting an object off the roadway, and the non-collision is overturning crashes after you've left the roadway. It contributes to about 44% of all fatal crashes, and the trend is sort of consistent. So vehicles departing the roadway is one of the prime causes of severe injury and fatal crashes. So now, looking at the risk for an individual driver for what speed does to their chance of involvement in a crash. So, most people, and maybe I'm guilty of it as well. I'm sure I am, of exceeding the speed limit. But you really sort of don't really place much it's hard for you to measure the risk, the incremental risk of your own exceeding the speed limit. But there's been quite a few studies that have looked at sort of the increased risk of sort of exceeding the average speed of traffic. So these studies sort of show, and one of the more famous one was done by Solomon in 1964, but let's see, the mouse will come up. Ooh. So they all sort of have this U-shaped curve where they've taken the speed of the driver involved in the crash and compared it to sort of the mean speed of all other vehicles on the roadway. There's some methodological differences between the studies. Some of them weren't done, perhaps, say, the best way. But they all sort of show the same, where here in the middle of the graph is sort of the average speed of traffic, and your risk of involvement in a crash increases both on the being slower than the average speed of traffic and also on being above the average speed of traffic. So you can sort of this gray line is a completely theoretical model by Hauer based on two-lane roadways and overtaking. So you can sort of get the idea that if all vehicles are traveling at the same speed, there's less chance for interaction, so there's less chance for crash. So a lot of these higher points here on the left side, these studies didn't take out turning vehicle out of their analysis. So that's why vehicles that have been shown over here that look like that you're really worse off going much slower than the average speed of traffic, your risk goes way up. Some of these studies were sort of flawed in the number of crashes they included. So there's been a whole host of studies on the change in fatalities, and either measuring it as just number of crashes, the number of people killed, or the fatality rate, so the number of crashes per some vehicle miles traveled. Both when the speed changed from 55 to 65, so that's everything to the left of this dashed vertical line, and a few studies after the speeds from 65 to 70. And everything above the red line shows kind of a positive increase in the number of fatalities or fatality-related crashes in states that have changed their speeds to the higher limits. So there's some debate about the quality of all of these studies. Both ones that show increases and ones that show decreases. I left a few ones that showed some other significant decreases off because they were very poor. But so almost all studies have sort of showed an increase after speed changes in the number of fatal crashes. So this graph here shows, this is Oregon rural interstates from the time that they were first being constructed in 1959 to 2004. The blue line is the number of fatalities on these roadways. So it sort of peaked just after the system was completed, with about 70 per year in 1963. When the system first opened, the Oregon interstate maximum speed limits were between 70 and 75. It depended on which section. Here is when their speed was lowered to 55 miles an hour. And then here is where it was changed to 65 miles an hour. And during the time where it was at 55 miles an hour, they were also required to do a lot of speed monitoring, so collecting a lot of average speed and 85th percentile speeds on the system. So when you look at just one state's performance, it's really, you see that the speed has been increasing regardless of the speed change. So even though it was 55, people were well over 65 by the time it changed to 65. And speeds have been increasing sort of each year, while the general trend in fatalities has sort of been downward. So I'm just kind of showing some different clues that we used in our final estimate. But here's one where you look at rural interstate fatality rates of sort of surrounding Northwest states and what happened when they changed their speed limits. You don't really see any change in the rates as much because it also includes a measure for vehicle exposure. So traffic has been increasing pretty much every year. So the change in the number of fatalities is a little harder to see. But you do see that Oregon is the blue state, the blue line on the bottom, and Washington is down here as well. Oregon is the only state that didn't change their speed limits. But you see sort of Oregon, Washington, and California down here in the lower tier. And the states that sort of changed to the higher limits, Idaho and Nevada, have kind of significantly higher rates of fatality per vehicle miles traveled. So much of the Oregon's rural interstate system is not covered by very good EMS service. So especially in a lot of the rural locations can have pretty significantly long response times. And this graph shows concentric 30-minute flight times from the scene to a trauma hospital. So you can see there's some pretty, I-84 here, there's some, and this piece of I-5, there's some significant gaps in times to a high-quality trauma facility. So Craig Newgard from Oregon Health and Sciences University participated in this part of the study, and his research found that a mature trauma system has benefits in reducing I think over 52% of all trauma cases in the Oregon trauma system are motor vehicle related, and a mature system can have impacts in health outcomes. And so trauma hospitals are sort of divided into 4 levels, with level 1 being the most equipped. The only level 1 hospitals are both in the Portland metro area, so they're at Legacy Emmanuel and Oregon Health and Sciences University. There's 6 level 2 trauma facilities. Some of them are out of state but treat Oregon patients. But a lot of the rural locations are covered by level 3 and level 4 trauma hospitals. And the research shows that if you present first to one of these lower level trauma hospitals, there's significant delays in getting you transported to a higher quality facility. And there are definitely significant health outcomes of presenting first to a lower level facility. So if you're in an interstate crash and you're in some rural location and they transfer you to a lower level trauma facilities, your outcomes are going to be worse than if you were transported to a level 1 facility. So so much of the state is not covered by quick access to a high level trauma system. So lastly, talking about, in this safety section, talking about the difference in truck and car limits. There's 2 states that have a 15-mile-an-hour difference between truck and car maximum speed limits. California and Michigan both have 55-mile-an-hour maximums for trucks and 70 for cars. And a handful of states 6 states have 10-mile-an-hour differences, either like Oregon 65-55 or 70-60, and a few have 5-mile-an-hour differences. So what would be the benefits of having lower speed limits for trucks? So kind of 2 arguments for and against. One, the trucks are heavy. They require more stopping distance. They present significantly more energy in collisions. And if you looked at collisions between cars and trucks, the occupant of the passenger vehicle, like 80% of the time, is the one that sustains the injuries. So the rationale for lowering truck limits is to keep truck speeds slower. And then the argument against that is that different truck speeds creates conflicts in the traffic stream, so introduces more opportunities for collisions. And then there's a economic cost to keeping your trucks at slower speeds. So the research wasn't really quite conclusive on this topic. The one thing it did point out is that they are effective at keeping truck speeds lower, but you need at least a 10-mile-an-hour difference to have any kind of effect on the observed speed of trucks. So locations where you have only a 5-mile-an-hour difference, such as the one that was proposed here in Oregon, a 70-65, essentially that's not enough of a difference for the trucks to really pay attention to, and they'll end up sort of traveling at the same speed as cars. So if you really want to have an effective differential speed limit, you need at least 10 miles an hour. But in terms of safety, the research really didn't show that there was any definitive conclusion, either for the people that argued against them, saying that it will cause more collisions because of the trucks conflicting with traffic, or for the people that said, you know, trucks are heavier and take longer stopping, so there'd be more collisions. The research didn't really show either way that either policy had any sort of effect on safety. So our conclusion, sort of boiling all of this down, with both looking at the trauma data from the trauma registry, from the crash information, and all the research reviewed, was to predict a slight increase in the number of fatalities and injuries if the speeds was changed from 65 to 70 in the system. So a 5 to 15% increase would result in about 2 to 11 persons fatally injured a year, and another 30 to 90 people with major injuries. So it's difficult to make this prediction. The research that we reviewed and it's kind of hard to kind of pin it down, but it kind of all pointed to a slight increase in fatalities. Some of the, not nearly as high as some of the studies predicted, like a 30-35%, but we sort of felt a 5 to 15% increase without any other mitigation measures was sort of a reasonable estimate of what would happen. So the one benefit of this, of increasing the speed limits, is there are some travel time benefits to motorists, but particularly to trucks, where it would have a 10-mile-an-hour increase in the speeds that they could travel, so there'd be a 15% reduction in their travel time. And we didn't quantify this number to compare with the cost of collisions and some of the other economic costs, but it's conceivable, but there's enough benefits here that it might be very close to the economic cost of some of the other impacts. But some of the benefits are not to people that are based in Oregon. A lot of it would be to through truck traffic. So there were some benefits not to Oregon residents. So Professor Dill looked at some of the environmental impacts in terms of fuel use and emissions use. And as you would expect, as the speeds increase, facing more aerodynamic drag, there'd be an increase in fuel usage for light vehicles, of these vehicles on the system, of about 9%, and for heavy vehicles, slightly more, about 20 to 25%. So correspondingly, there'd be an increase in emissions, and these are from the EPA's Mobile 6 model, is that right? So these are speed correction factors. So Professor Dill made an estimate that from light vehicles, if the speed was changed, there'd be a 5% increase in emissions, more significant increase for trucks in terms of NOx and carbon monoxide increases. They really weren't looking at increases in the urban area, so the impacts sort of to urban air quality probably would not have been that measurable. But most of the speed changes were proposed in sort of rural areas. So lastly, as part of the process, somebody wanted us to look at noise impacts. So we ran some numbers through a traffic impact noise model from the Federal Highway Administration. And in urban areas where the truck speeds were not proposed to change, because they were probably not going to be raising any urban interstates, so the trucks would stay at 55. There's really no noise impact, and light vehicles weren't likely to change either. But in rural areas, there would have been a slight increase in the impacted sort of noise area of about 80 feet. So there were some caveats to sort of our overall study. Is one, we didn't look at the effects of the aging population, so that may not be more comfortable driving at higher speeds and would also be more likely to be injured in higher speed crashes. Even though we predicted an increase in the number of crashes, we didn't look at the additional delay that might be imposed on the system by those crashes. And we didn't sort of look at sort of this wide scoping. If state police were already overburdened, would they have to call on local law enforcement to bring in help to enforce on the interstates in terms of crashes and enforcement? And lastly, would there be some effect on living and commuting patterns, where if the speeds from, say, Salem to Portland were raised to 70, would people sort of maybe change their living and commuting patterns? We didn't look at any of these. So our conclusions then, sort of the relationship between speed, travel time, fuel use, and pollution, those are relatively easy and direct. They're sort of one-to-one relationships. We were less confident sort of in our speed and safety predictions, but because the relationship is a little less clear there. And travel time was really sort of the only positive benefit that we recommended or that we found in the report. So our conclusions were, one is that this report really was about providing information to decision makers that they could make trade-offs between between safety, mobility, and efficiency. So there are some negatives, there are some positives to making the changes, and so this report was to provide them sort of what was maybe scientifically defensible evidence of either for or against those cases. So our recommendations, if they did decide to raise the speed, was that there would need to be some additional investment in enforcement resources, just because there's sort of anecdotal evidence that from the Oregon State Patrol that they currently sort of have like a 10-mile-an-hour buffer before they'll start enforcing the rural interstate speeds, and they were likely sort of to kind of keep that with their limited staff. So they would need an increase in staff to sort of step up the enforcement to keep speeds from really increasing on the interstate. And since people that also speed engage in other risky behaviors like driving while intoxicated or seatbelt use, sort of enhancing some of those campaigns might limit some of the safety impacts, and some more investment in emergency medical services. And lastly, just sort of to monitor the crash experience, if it was worse or less than what we predicted, to make modifications. So as I mentioned, Craig Newgard from Oregon Health and Sciences, Professor Dill, Professor Ruffalo, and Professor Bettini from Portland State, Beth Wemple from Kittleson, and Craig Milliken, who did the noise analysis, and some of our students, Aaron Qureshi, Matt Lasky, and Jacob Baglian and Jenny Kincaid helped with the report. So before I get to the questions, the final recommendation after all of this effort and review and study was that the department decided that they were not going to raise interstate speeds anywhere except for a few urban sections where they raised it from 55 to 60 miles an hour. So one of their kind of significant hang-ups was the requirement of raising the truck speeds to 65. A lot of the policy and decision makers felt that was not, that they were not, the truck 85th percentile speed was below 65 miles an hour in many cases, and so they were not comfortable raising the truck speeds. They probably might have been in favor of a 70-60, but there were many advocates just in favor of not raising the speeds at all. So the final decision of the Oregon Transportation Commission was to leave the Oregon interstate speed limits as they are. So with that, I think I have about 15 minutes for questions. And
could you remind people about using the microphone?
yeah. So, and if you ask a question, we're broadcasting live on the web, so remember to press the button on the microphone. So, Steve?
Do you know why in Salem only the north section was increased to 65 and the southern was left at 55?
Yeah, that section
60,
was
55.
left over from the old federal laws that was set the 65-55 on sort of city boundaries. So that law no longer applies, so they decided to make an adjustment to where they thought it was more appropriate, not based on sort of city boundaries.
And also, is there anything like on the vehicle movement restrictions for increasing the truck speed? So a lot of times, like cars are moving into the faster traffic in the left lane to kind of go around the trucks.
Yeah.
So I know they're pulling out in front of me all the time. Is there any research on that?
Who's pulling out? I don't. I guess could you?
Like the number of accidents reduced from the cars, the speed change from cars that are in the right lane and pulling into faster traffic in the left lane to avoid the trucks. Like if the trucks were increased.
Oh yeah.
They'd be
So
going faster.
the studies on the differential speed limits between cars and trucks looked at the sort of the overall safety performance of those states that had the ones that didn't have the different speed limits for trucks and the ones that had sort of the uniform speed limit. And the ones that had the differential speed limit, there was more of a sort of a car into truck collision problem. The ones that had the uniform where everybody was going the same speeds, it was more trucks hitting cars. But neither of them were sort of significantly different. So it depends a lot on truck volume too. So
why didn't this study show the number of licensed drivers per trooper in the state?
Oh, I did have some other measures on population. Oregon was still sort of, out of the 5 states, was 4th. Or no, it was actually 5th in that one. With the number of, there's one trooper for like every 11,000 citizens in Oregon. And in California, it's like 1 for every 6. In Washington, 1 for every 8 or something like that. So I used population sort of as licensed driver measure. Kate?
One of the big problems with the increasing the speed limit was that there wasn't enough troopers. Do you know anything about the relationship to being able to fund the troopers with the fact that they're ticketing more people? I mean, it seems like troopers make money for the state, not lose it. So
there has been, I'm not exactly sure of the funding mechanism. I think their ticket revenue doesn't go into their operating budget, so they really don't have the incentive to write more tickets. But there has been some talk about funding. They used to be funded by by a piece of the gas tax. So about 15 years ago, there was like 650 Oregon State Troopers. But there was the constitutional requirement in Oregon doesn't allow any non-highway things to be funded by the gas tax. So there was a court ruling that eliminated the state patrol from being funded out of that. So they lost that sort of funding source, and now they've been battling in the general fund, and they've been sort of not been winners a lot of times. So they're down to some pretty low trooper strength. I guess the governor has proposed funding some troopers out of video lottery this session. So there is a recognition that there needs to be an increase. Aaron?
One of the charts showed the average speed increasing in recent years. Why do you think that is?
It's sort of just been a general trend, sort of everywhere that's been monitored, is that speeds have sort of been moving up. The longer you drive at higher speeds, the more comfortable you get. Drivers drive in other states that have higher speed limits. Cars are definitely a lot different now than they were 20, 30 years ago. You can sort of drive that fast without much knowledge, really, or feeling it from your comfort level what that speed is. Right here.
Did you look into, or did somebody look into the age of the car and the mechanics of the car? Basically, nowadays cars are equipped with anti-lock braking systems, and they're faster, and older cars getting more into accidents.
No, we didn't look at any of that type of specific information about vehicles. Back there.
Yeah, you mentioned initially that in 03 when the state ledge allowed ODOT to actually look at the possibility of considering a speed increase, and it seems to me even the consideration. I guess I just don't understand really even the need for consideration. I understand that economics seems to be the only that could come from it, and I guess if you could talk a little more about that, maybe.
Well, there's I mean, there's a constituency of people, particularly rural legislators, that would like the speeds to be raised, and they've professed that they've operated their vehicles well above the speed, and there's one legislator in particular that has made it sort of his kind of, he always introduces this bill. So it's a political decision. So in a lot of other states, the legislature just said you will raise the speeds to 70 or 75, and that was kind of the end of the debate. But here, I don't think they had enough votes to do that this time, so they sort of thought that maybe if they let ODOT look at it, they might raise it without the need for more political votes. So, Tom, do you have a question?
Chris, I-5 is a major artery. It only goes through, 3 states, from Mexico to Canada. And it seems like there's somewhat of a uniform in California and Washington, where major urban areas, they have the speed gets reduced. Like when you go from, let's say, Oregon, you start in Washington in the south and you go up to Olympia, it's like 70, and then it slows down like 55 all the way past Seattle, and then it goes back up to 70. I'm sure truckers have talked about that and seen the changeover from California to Oregon and then up again to Washington. But did you ever look more closely at Washington and see how effective those corridors are and those sections? Because it seems like in Oregon, it's a perfect example of where from southern Oregon up to Salem, you could almost go 70 and then create that zone of 55 to 65 up to the border.
They didn't look at Washington as a specific example, but they did study individual sections, and look at what they thought the geometry and sort of the roadside culture might support. So there were sections where they thought a 70 mile an hour, might be supported by sort of the road geometry and the speeds that people were already operating at. But sort of like I mentioned, their sort of one hang-up was the raising the truck speed. Matt?
Just as a follow-up to an earlier question, what do you think is going to happen next? Like, will this keep on coming up in the legislature? Will they be able to pass a higher speed without increasing speeds for trucks?
I don't know. I haven't kept my ear to the ground on this. What's happening politically? I know there was a lot of the process took a while, and so the Department of Transportation took a lot of heat publicly while they were sort of making this decision. But I haven't really heard any grumbling since. Although I think the one senator, Randy Miller, is no longer in the Senate anymore. So, but it's probably going to come up again. So. Roger? You have to hold it down. The one in, doesn't work. No, the right in front.
Oh. Okay, my question has a couple different parts to it. Looking at how vehicle speeds are proposed to have an average increase of 2 to 4 miles per hour with a 5 mile per hour additional speed limit. And also with the piece that other states, this is kind of a compound question, other states that raised their speeds from 65 to 70, did they do safe and reasonable speed? Look at all of the sections of highway to find out what the safe and reasonable speed is to determine what sections would be increased. And if so, if there would be a 2 to 4 mile per hour increase in Oregon, increasing those speeds would then, I guess the question is, we're looking at accident rates at other states that most likely didn't do the safe and reasonable speed impact study, and then comparing it to our state where we're only increasing it in the sections of a highway that would work. Do you kind of understand the question?
I guess the way to answer that question is that even though they looked at 40 individual sections, they were one of the primary decisions when they were making their final recommendations is they didn't want the speed flip-flopping like every 4 or 5 miles. So they were going to make large sections of the roadway the same speed. So it would be much like it is now. If it was 65, they would make it 70. So they weren't going to be picking small sections to sort of lower to 55 unless they were already low, like through the Siskiyous or through 405 is 50 miles an hour, or through the Terwilliger curves, or through the Myrtle Creek curves. There are certain sections of the freeway that already have sort of permanent lower speeds. Did that answer your question?
I guess the question is, if we look at section by section of highway, whether they're large or small, and we increase only the sections that can be increased, would that not provide a safer increased speed limit than the other states that just increased it all around the state without doing the impact studies?
Yeah, presumably, but I guess I would still think that the speeds would increase, whether you did it selectively or altogether.
When you mentioned that the Oregon Highway Patrol currently has a 10-mile-an-hour buffer before they start enforcing the speed limits.
Don't quote me on that.
Was their attitude that they were going to maintain 10 miles above the new speed limit, or were they going to maintain their enforcement at the current speed where they were currently beginning to ticket?
Well, there was some, not quite confidential surveys, but people made some phone calls, and yes, they would make the 10 mile an hour above what the new speed would be. So the reason they have that buffer is that there are just so many people to choose from. So they can stand out on the interstate, and even if they set it at 10 miles an hour, they still have a significant number of people to pull over. So they, with their reduced trooper strength, they sort of view their safety, their public safety, mission is to catch the people that are significantly exceeding the speed limit. So you can talk to a trooper, and he can be out on the interstate for 10 minutes, and he'll have no trouble finding somebody going 80, 85. So there's also sort of there's a judicial aspect to this, that even if you get a ticket, it goes to a judge. And some of the tickets are cited under what's called the basic rule. So a judge may not agree that the officer should have given you a ticket. In a lot of the rural locations, judges have sort of their own buffer that they've let the troopers know, don't write a ticket for less than 10 because I'll throw it out. So there's also that aspect. So I'll go with Zach.
Certainly other states have higher speed limits, and certainly European countries do. I'd imagine that most of these places have also done research into the effect of higher speed on fatalities. What do you think the major factors are that they've determined to maybe ignore in order to have higher speed limits?
Well, the one graph that I showed that had all the plots appointed above the red line are sort of only a snapshot of all the studies that have been done looking at the changes. And like I mentioned, there's a lot of methodological differences in the studies, and some people have their own personal views of what they think happens when speeds are changed. And so in locations, most of this is a political decision that's been made. It's rarely sort of an engineering type decision, so it's been made at sort of the policy level. So I'm not sure they consciously are saying that there's going to be an increase in fatalities and that's okay with us. They probably are more thinking that they are not expecting an increase in fatalities. So
in that case, is the impact of a personal choice? Like, for example, cars fatalities involve only single car. Maybe those shouldn't be counted. People are taking the risk themselves to drive at faster speeds.
Yeah, I mean that is in a way true, but in some cases, there are societal impacts. If somebody makes a personal choice and they are cared for by the the Oregon health system or some of those, so there are some of those impacts. Tom?
Chris, did the commission or the researchers look at sort of time variant speed limits? Because it seems like space is addressed in great detail, but not time.
Time over.
For example, you just take the drive from Portland to Seattle after 10 o'clock at night. Why not raise the speed limit after 10?
Oh. I know there used to be, Texas used to have a differential day-night limit, and I think Montana had a differential day-night limit. And they didn't, none of the studies that we looked at there's sort of unique enough cases that they didn't look at those. And there was some talk early on about different time of day speed limits or different weather conditions speed limits, but the conclusion was they didn't have the technology or the funds available to make that work. So I have one more question. So
I may have missed this on your slides on pollution, but do you know if any studies have ever looked at increase in not just emissions, but particulates from increasing tread wear at higher speeds, especially from trucks?
Maybe.
I did that section. I don't have a microphone, so you might want to.
Yeah.
I didn't see any that specifically looked at PM. I guess if the wheels are turning faster more frequently per mile, I guess there could be, but yeah.
Okay. So thanks for your attention. Oh.